China,
China,
China, China,
China,
China,
China,
China,
China.
The trade deficit between America and China just hit its lowest point in 21 years, $9.5 billion. That's all that separates the world's two largest economies in their monthly trade balance. For context, that gap was $30 billion just 6 months ago. But here's what should terrify every American manufacturer. China didn't achieve this by buying more from us. They achieved it by teaching the world they don't need us anymore. When Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent landed in Stockholm this July for emergency trade negotiations, he carried with him a simple message from President Trump: submit or suffer. The administration had already forced new deals with Europe and Japan through bilateral pressure. China was supposed to be next. Instead, what unfolded in that Swedish conference room revealed something far more dangerous than defiance. It revealed indifference. The Chinese delegation listened politely as Bessent laid out America's demands. Stop buying sanctioned Russian oil, purchase more American goods, reduce industrial overcapacity. In exchange, Washington might delay the devastating tariffs set to trigger August 12th. Beijing's response was almost surgical in its precision. They lifted some restrictions on rare earth magnet exports, materials critical to American defense systems. Then they stopped. No promises on oil purchases, no commitments on trade rebalancing, just a calculated message. We'll give you enough to keep talking, but we won't restructure our economy on your timeline. The Chinese take their sovereignty very seriously, one senior trade official later revealed. When we warned them about secondary sanctions on Russian oil, they essentially said they'd rather pay 100% tariff than compromise their energy security. Think about that for a moment. China is so confident in its economic position that it's willing to absorb massive penalties rather than bend to American pressure. This isn't the China of 10 years ago, desperately dependent on access to American markets. While U.S. negotiators pushed for immediate results, Beijing played a different game entirely. They agreed in principle to extend the tariff truce, but made it conditional on Trump's personal approval. They emphasized procedural cooperation rather than substantive concessions. More meetings, more reports, more delays. It's dead by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts, and it's working. The numbers tell the real story. China still controls over 90% of global rare earth refining capacity. When they restored some magnet exports to American firms, they called it a goodwill gesture. But everyone in that room knew the truth. Beijing holds the keys to technologies America desperately needs, from F-35 fighter jets to electric vehicle batteries. They can turn off that supply whenever they choose. Meanwhile, something even more alarming is happening north of the border. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, Canada's economic powerhouse, just said what no Canadian leader has dared say before. If Trump's tariffs continue, Canada will pivot to China. This isn't some fringe politician making empty threats. Ford oversees $43 billion in annual trade with China, and he's ready to expand it. You know what Churchill said, Ford told reporters last week. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. As long as China plays fair and doesn't undercut our markets, I have no problem dealing with them. Those words should send shockwaves through Washington. Canada purchases $349 billion of American goods annually. That's more than Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined. If even a fraction of that trade shifts to China, American workers will feel it immediately. The evidence is already mounting. Canadian brewers have started sourcing aluminum cans from China instead of the United States. Why? Trump's tariffs made American aluminum too expensive. Provincial governments are actively exploring new trade routes that bypass America entirely. They're not doing this because they want to. They're doing it because Trump's unpredictability has made America an unreliable partner. But Trump's response has been to double down. On July 7th, he announced that any country aligning with BRICS, the economic bloc led by China, would face an additional 10% tariff. The threat is breathtakingly broad. Using non-dollar currencies? That's alignment. Building alternative supply chains? That's alignment. Participating in infrastructure cooperation? That's alignment too. The problem is, Trump just threatened most of the developing world. India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa. These aren't anti-American nations. They're countries trying to balance relationships with both Washington and Beijing. By forcing them to choose sides, Trump may be pushing them exactly where he doesn't want them to go. China's response has been masterful in its restraint. No angry denunciations, no retaliatory tariffs. Instead, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian calmly explained that BRICS is a platform for cooperation, not confrontation. Trade wars and tariff wars have no winners, he said. Protectionism leads nowhere. While Trump threatens, China positions itself as the responsible adult, the stable partner in an unstable world. Behind the scenes, Beijing is building something far more powerful than any tariff wall. Over the past month, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has crisscrossed Europe, signing deals for nuclear plants, solar installations, and energy infrastructure. They're creating facts on the ground, binding economies together through concrete projects rather than abstract threats. They're showing the world that there's another way to do business, one that doesn't involve ultimatums every few months. The most brilliant part of China's strategy is what they're not doing. They're not abandoning the dollar dramatically. They're not imposing counter tariffs. They're not walking away from negotiations. Instead, they're slowly, methodically building alternative systems while keeping just enough engagement with America to avoid triggering a complete breakdown. It's economic judo, using America's own aggression against itself. The Stockholm negotiations revealed something else that should alarm every American policymaker. When Bessent pressed Chinese officials on their growing trade with Russia, particularly oil purchases that now exceed 2 million barrels daily, Beijing's negotiators didn't flinch. They calmly explained that energy security is non-negotiable for a nation of 1.4 billion people. "We will not sacrifice our citizens' well-being for political theater," one Chinese official reportedly stated during a break in negotiations. This isn't mere rhetoric. China has quietly built a parallel financial infrastructure that makes American sanctions increasingly irrelevant. Their cross-border interbank payment system now processes over $400 billion monthly, completely outside the reach of U.S. financial controls. When Washington threatens to cut off dollar access, Beijing shrugs. They've already built the escape routes. The consequences are rippling through global markets in ways most Americans haven't noticed yet. Indonesia just announced it will settle all palm oil trades with China in yuan. Malaysia is considering similar arrangements for semiconductor exports. Even Saudi Arabia, America's longtime petrodollar partner, is exploring yuan-denominated oil sales to Chinese buyers. Each announcement is small on its own. Together, they represent the slow-motion collapse of the financial architecture that has underpinned American power since World War II. What we're witnessing is not de-dollarization, explains Dr. Sarah Chen, a former Federal Reserve economist who now advises multinational corporations. It's optionality. Countries aren't abandoning the dollar. They're creating alternatives for when America weaponizes it. And once those alternatives exist, they tend to grow. The numbers support her analysis. UN usage in international trade has jumped 47% in just 18 months. That's still a fraction of dollar dominance, but the trajectory is unmistakable. Every time Trump threatens tariffs, more countries hedge their bets. Every ultimatum creates new converts to China's vision of a multipolar financial system. Perhaps nothing illustrates this shift better than what happened in Brussels 3 weeks after Stockholm. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was supposed to announce new restrictions on Chinese electric vehicles. Instead, she unveiled a framework for managed competition that essentially legitimizes Chinese industrial policy. The reversal stunned American diplomats who had spent months lobbying for a united front against Beijing. The reason for Europe's pivot? Simple math. Chinese companies now employ over 200,000 Europeans directly. They've invested 90 billion euros in local manufacturing. When push comes to shove, European leaders chose jobs over ideology. They chose pragmatism over pressure. Most importantly, they chose not to follow America down the path of economic confrontation. This pattern is repeating globally. Thailand just approved Chinese construction of a new deep-water port that will handle 30% of Southeast Asian trade. Vietnam signed agreements for Chinese-built nuclear reactors, despite decades of territorial disputes. Even the Philippines, a treaty ally currently locked in maritime confrontations with China, quietly increased bilateral trade by 23% last quarter. Countries are learning to compartmentalize, notes Ambassador James Morrison, who spent 3 decades in Asian capitals. They'll cooperate with America on security, but integrate with China economically. Trump's all-or-nothing approach ignores this reality. The Stockholm meeting's most revealing moment came during discussions about artificial intelligence. American negotiators demanded China halt all technology transfers to sanctioned entities. Beijing's response was to announce that very day a new AI research center in Singapore open to all developing nations. The message was crystal clear. While America builds walls, China builds bridges. This isn't charity, it's strategy. By positioning itself as the partner that shares rather than restricts, China is winning hearts and minds across the global south. When African Union officials need infrastructure financing, they don't call Washington anymore. They call Beijing. When Latin American countries want to modernize their ports, Chinese companies submit the bids. Each project creates dependencies, loyalties, and alternatives to the American-led order. The real genius of China's approach is its patience. While Trump measures success in quarterly trade deficits, Beijing thinks in decades. They're not trying to replace the dollar tomorrow. They're creating conditions where, 10 years from now, countries will naturally gravitate toward a basket of currencies. They're not challenging American military dominance directly. They're making it economically irrelevant. Consider what's happening with critical minerals. While Bessent celebrated China's decision to ease restrictions on rare earth magnets, Beijing quietly signed new mining agreements across Africa. They now control extraction rights for lithium, cobalt, and copper deposits that won't produce for 5 years. By the time those mines open, China won't need to restrict exports. They'll own the entire supply chain from the ground up. The Americans are fighting yesterday's war, observes Liu Wei, a Shanghai-based economist with connections to China's planning apparatus. They think in terms of bilateral trade balances. We think in terms of production networks. They threaten tariffs. We build factories. They isolate. We integrate. The Stockholm talks ended with a joint statement so vague it could mean anything. Both sides agreed to continue dialogue and explore mutually beneficial arrangements. Bessent claimed victory, pointing to China's magnet export adjustments. Chinese media portrayed it as American acceptance of Beijing's core interests. Neither narrative captures the real dynamic. What actually happened was more subtle and more significant. China demonstrated it could absorb American pressure without fundamental changes to its economic model. It showed other countries that resistance is possible, even profitable. Most importantly, it revealed that America's threats have diminishing returns. When you threaten everyone simultaneously, you unite them against you. The immediate aftermath tells the story. Within 72 hours of Stockholm's conclusion, China announced new trade agreements with 9 countries. Not massive deals, but steady, incremental progress. Railway upgrades in Kenya, solar farms in Chile, port modernization in Greece. Each project small enough to avoid headlines, significant enough to matter. Meanwhile, American manufacturers are sounding alarms that Washington seems unable to hear. Boeing lost a $40 billion aircraft order to Airbus because Chinese airlines worried about supply chain reliability. General Motors reported its worst Chinese quarterly sales in a decade. Apple quietly accelerated plans to diversify production away from both countries, hedging against a world where U.S. China economic warfare becomes permanent. "We're caught in the middle," explains Michael Torres, CEO of a mid-sized automotive parts supplier. "Our biggest customer is in Detroit. Our most critical components come from Shenzhen. Every time politicians rattle sabers, our business model breaks a little more." His company's solution mirrors thousands of others. They're establishing subsidiaries in third countries, creating complex ownership structures to navigate both American and Chinese regulations. They're essentially building corporate escape routes from the economic war zone. It's inefficient, expensive, and unsustainable. But in a world where trade policy changes with every tweet, it's the only survival strategy that works.
It's the trade war that shows no sign of being resolved anytime soon. The two biggest economies, China and the United States, in a tit-for-tat battle over increasing tariffs. China has announced it's raising levies on US goods to 125% after Washington imposed tariffs of 145% this week. Beijing says it does not intend for the tax, saying it would be meaningless to engage in further escalation.
China has announced a new tariff of 125% on US imports, matching the recent increase from the US. It's the latest escalation in the growing trade war between the two countries that has the markets running scared. The Aussie stock market shed nearly $60 billion in value despite a brief rally as the US paused their tariffs against most of the world.
Well, investors can expect another white-knuckle day as stock markets react to the latest escalation in the trade war between the United States and China. Overnight, China hiked its tariffs on U.S. goods from 84% to 125%.
The moment China announced it would raise tariffs on American goods to 125%, financial markets around the world froze. Traders in New York watched their screens in disbelief as the yuan surged against the dollar, while Beijing's message was crystal clear. The era of American economic dominance was under attack. This wasn't supposed to happen. For decades, the United States held the ultimate economic weapon, the power to cut any nation off from the global financial system. But something fundamental has shifted. China, the world's factory floor, has decided it no longer needs to play by Washington's rules, and the consequences are reverberating through every major economy on the planet. The numbers tell a story of unprecedented escalation. When President Trump slapped 145% tariffs on Chinese imports, he expected Beijing to buckle. Instead, China's response sent shockwaves through Washington. Not only did they retaliate with their own crushing tariffs, but they accelerated a plan years in the making, the systematic reduction of the dollar's role in global trade. We're witnessing the unraveling of a 70-year-old financial order, notes Dr. Sarah Chen, a former Federal Reserve economist now teaching at Columbia. What China is doing isn't just retaliation. It's a calculated dismantling of American financial hegemony. The evidence is everywhere. In Vietnam and Cambodia, Chinese payment systems are replacing dollar-based transactions. The People's Bank of China has quietly expanded its cross-border interbank payment system to handle over 80 trillion yuan in transactions annually. Most alarming for Washington, China's foreign exchange reserves, the world's largest at $3.285 trillion, are being strategically redeployed away from American assets. This shift didn't happen overnight. For years, China accepted its designation as a developing country by international institutions, a label that granted access to favorable loans and trade terms. American officials watched with growing alarm as the world's second-largest economy continued to benefit from programs designed for genuinely poor nations. When they finally moved to strip China of this status, they triggered a chain reaction they didn't anticipate. The Asian Development Bank became the first battleground. Under intense pressure from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, the institution was forced to cut off loans to China. A country with a $19 trillion economy shouldn't be receiving development aid, Bessent argued at a recent investor conference. But his victory was Pyrrhic. Within weeks, China announced expanded lending through its own Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, an institution the United States had refused to join. The real shock came when American customs revenue hit $64 billion in the first quarter of 2025, $47 billion more than the previous year. While politicians celebrated this windfall, economists saw something darker. Those aren't Chinese companies paying these tariffs, explains Professor Michael Zhang of MIT. It's American importers and ultimately American consumers. We're essentially taxing ourselves to hurt China. Meanwhile, Beijing's counter-strategy has been methodical and devastating. China UnionPay's expansion into Southeast Asia isn't just about payment processing. It's about creating an entirely parallel financial infrastructure. When a Vietnamese textile manufacturer can sell to a German buyer using yuan instead of dollars, it removes one more brick from the foundation of American financial power. The numbers are staggering. Trade between China and ASEAN nations reached $234 billion in just 3 months, with an increasing percentage conducted in yuan. The Qatar Investment Authority's recent acquisition of a 10% stake in a major Chinese financial firm signals that even oil-rich Gulf states are hedging their bets against the dollar. President Trump's response has been characteristically blunt. At a Wisconsin rally, he declared, "You leave the dollar and you're not doing business with the United States because we are going to put a 100% tariff on your goods." But this threat rings hollow when directed at China, which has already absorbed 145% tariffs and responded in kind. The technological dimension of this conflict adds another layer of complexity. While headlines focus on tariffs, the real battle is being fought in semiconductor fabs and AI research centers. China's BYD has slashed electric vehicle prices by up to 30%, directly challenging Tesla in markets from Berlin to Bangkok. This isn't just competition. It's a systematic assault on industries America once dominated. The mistake Washington made was assuming economic coercion would slow China's technological advancement, observes Dr. James Liu, a technology policy expert at Stanford. Instead, it accelerated their drive for self-sufficiency. Every restriction we impose pushes them to develop their own alternatives. The Belt and Road Initiative, now encompassing 150 countries, represents China's most ambitious challenge to the American-led order. While U.S. officials denounce these infrastructure loans as debt traps, recipient nations see them differently. When Kenya needs a new port or Pakistan requires power plants, Chinese financing arrives without lectures about democracy or human rights. The irony isn't lost on international observers. America, with a national debt exceeding $35 trillion, including $750 billion owed to China, lectures others about fiscal responsibility while threatening those who dare to diversify away from the dollar. This hypocrisy undermines Washington's moral authority and strengthens Beijing's narrative of American decline. Financial markets are already pricing in this new reality. The dollar's sharp sell-off in recent months reflects growing doubts about its future as the world's reserve currency. Goldman Sachs analysts note that every 1% rise in the yuan's value boosts Chinese equities by 3%, creating a powerful feedback loop that draws more international investment into Chinese markets. The speed of change is breathtaking. State-owned Chinese banks now process 40% of cross-border transactions in yuan, up from virtually zero a decade ago. The digital yuan, still in its pilot phase, promises to accelerate this trend by offering instantaneous, sanctions-proof international transfers. The most dangerous moment came on a Tuesday morning in Shanghai. China's central bank governor stood before international media and calmly announced that all rare earth exports to the United States would now require payment in yuan. Within minutes, Pentagon officials were scrambling to assess how long America's defense contractors could maintain production without Chinese materials. This wasn't just another trade restriction. China controls 90% of global rare earth processing, materials essential for everything from F-35 fighter jets to wind turbines. By weaponizing this monopoly and demanding yuan payments, Beijing had found America's Achilles heel. We've known about this vulnerability for 20 years, admits Robert Harrison, a former Department of Defense procurement specialist. We just never believed they'd actually pull the trigger. The ripple effects were immediate. Lockheed Martin's stock plummeted 15%. General Motors announced potential delays in electric vehicle production. Most troubling for Washington, allied nations began quietly negotiating their own yuan payment arrangements with Beijing, unwilling to risk their own supply chains for American principles. Inside the White House Situation Room, advisors presented increasingly dire projections. If China expanded yuan-only requirements to other critical materials, lithium, cobalt, graphite, American industry would face an existential choice: abandon the dollar or abandon production. Treasury models suggested that even a 10% shift in global commodity pricing away from dollars could trigger a currency crisis unprecedented in modern history. Beijing's strategy extended far beyond raw materials. In a coordinated move, China's sovereign wealth fund began divesting American treasury bonds at an accelerated pace, converting them to gold and euro-denominated assets. While they couldn't dump all $750 billion at once without destroying their own portfolio value, the message was unmistakable. China is demonstrating they can hurt us as much as we can hurt them, notes Rebecca Martinez, chief economist at Morgan Stanley. That's a form of mutual assured destruction we haven't seen in economics before. The human cost of this conflict became visible in America's heartland. In Ohio, a factory producing electronic components shut down after losing access to affordable Chinese inputs. The 1,200 workers who lost their jobs became statistics in a larger tragedy. American manufacturing employment fell by 180,000 in just 6 months. Politicians promised to bring production home, but the reality was stark. Building domestic rare earth processing facilities would take years and cost billions. Meanwhile, China's alternative financial architecture gained momentum daily. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange saw trading volumes surge 45% as more countries agreed to price oil trades in yuan. When Saudi Aramco accepted partial yuan payment for a major crude delivery to China, it marked a watershed moment. The petrodollar system, foundation of American financial power since 1974, showed its first serious cracks. What we're witnessing is the controlled demolition of Bretton Woods, explains Dr. Patricia Kumar, an international finance expert at Harvard. China isn't trying to destroy the system overnight. They're creating alternatives and letting countries choose. That's far more dangerous than direct confrontation. The technological battlefield proved equally treacherous. China's announcement of a breakthrough in 7-nanometer chip production using domestic equipment shattered Western assumptions about the effectiveness of technology sanctions. While American firms were banned from selling advanced chip-making tools to China, Chinese engineers had achieved what experts deemed impossible just 2 years earlier. This success story repeated across industries. Huawei's new smartphone outsold Apple in China for the first time since sanctions began. Chinese electric vehicles dominated markets from São Paulo to Cape Town. Each victory reinforced Beijing's message. America's technological monopoly was ending, and with it, its economic leverage. The State Department's response revealed growing desperation. Diplomatic cables, leaked to the press, showed American ambassadors pleading with allies to maintain dollar usage. The conversations were embarrassing. German officials pointed to their massive trade surplus with China. Japanese negotiators noted their geographic reality. China was next door, America an ocean away. Even Britain, the special relationship notwithstanding, quietly expanded yuan clearing operations in London. President Trump's threat to impose 100% tariffs on countries abandoning the dollar faced an uncomfortable reality. How could America sanction the entire world? When Brazil and India announced a bilateral trade agreement using local currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely, it became clear that American threats were losing their power. The Federal Reserve found itself in an impossible position. Raising interest rates to defend the dollar would crush an already fragile domestic economy. Keeping them low risked accelerating capital flight to higher-yielding Chinese assets. Fed Chair Jerome Powell's congressional testimony revealed the strain. "We're navigating uncharted waters," he admitted. "Traditional monetary policy tools assume dollar dominance. Without that assumption, we need new models." China's domestic propaganda machine portrayed these developments as historical justice. State media reminded citizens of the century of humiliation when Western powers carved up Chinese territory. Now, commentators argued, China was simply reclaiming its rightful place. The message resonated beyond China's borders. In Africa and Latin America, nations that had chafed under IMF structural adjustments saw China's rise as liberation from Western financial colonialism. The numbers supported this narrative. Chinese development banks approved $89 billion in new international loans, surpassing the World Bank for the third consecutive year. Unlike Western institutions, these loans came with no governance requirements, no environmental restrictions, no democracy prerequisites. For authoritarian leaders from Cairo to Caracas, Beijing offered what Washington couldn't: money without moralizing. Energy markets provided the clearest evidence of shifting power dynamics. China's massive renewable energy investments, $180 billion in solar and wind capacity in 2024 alone, positioned it as the indispensable player in the global energy transition. While American politicians debated the reality of climate change, China cornered the market on its solutions. "We spent decades talking about green energy while China built it," observes Dr. Elena Rodriguez, an energy policy expert at Princeton. "Now they control the supply chains, the technology, and increasingly, the financing. We're watching the birth of a green yuan standard." The Wall Street establishment's response evolved from dismissal to alarm to reluctant adaptation. Major investment banks quietly established yuan trading desks. Hedge funds developed strategies to profit from dollar decline. The migration of financial talent from New York to Hong Kong and Singapore accelerated. American capitalism's greatest strength, its adaptability, was being turned against American interests. Corporate boardrooms faced wrenching decisions. Boeing executives calculated that losing Chinese aircraft orders would eliminate 40,000 American jobs. Apple realized that Chinese consumers represented 30% of iPhone profits. These companies, pillars of American economic might, increasingly found their interests diverging from Washington's geopolitical objectives. The intelligence community's assessments grew darker by the month. CIA analyses suggested that China's yuan internationalization campaign was just phase 1 of a 3-phase strategy. Phase 2 involved creating a China-centric supply chain network across Asia. Phase 3, still taking shape, appeared aimed at establishing technological standards that would lock in Chinese dominance for decades.